Hey nerds, just Jamie here with
your friend Claude.
And this is the premiere of Season 2 of Nerd Bomber vs. Movies, the show where two movies fight and we pick a winner. Now, before we talk about today's movie pairing, I will kind of talk a little bit about what's going to be new this year, and the main change is a new scoring category. As you know, we usually talk about writing, which can encompass plot, narrative, dialogue. We talk about visuals, which can encompass art direction, production design, special effects, costuming, and we talk about performances, which can be the performances of actors, voice performances, even puppetry at times. And the new category is going to be audio. Claude, you want to say a little something about what we are thinking when we say audio?
If you can hear it, it's part of the category. We're talking score music, we're talking soundtrack, we're talking sound effects, we're talking, even in some cases, maybe things that are spoken but don't fit into another performance category. Anything that goes in here will go in there.
All right, so that does it for what's new. Now, let's talk about today's movies. Today's movies are both ostensibly knockoffs of two of George Lucas's biggest successes, those being Star Wars and Indiana Jones. First up, we'll have 1980's Battle Beyond the Stars. Obviously, this is the one that we kind of connect to Star Wars. And the other one being 1985's King Solomon's Mines, which is a movie that's obviously trying to take advantage of the success of the Indiana Jones franchise.
Yeah.
So before we jump in deep, any initial thoughts about these?
I've heard of them in the recesses of my mind somewhere. Just kind of heard of them once, knew they existed, and kind of never thought of them again until recently. I saw somebody in an article or another YouTube video comparing Battle Beyond the Stars to Star Wars, and I noticed that there was a trend in this time period for making movies that are comparable to more popular movies.
Sure.
In genre and style and what have you. And first time viewing for this show.
Yeah, I had seen Battle Beyond the Stars once before, a long time ago. I didn't actually have much. When I watched the movie fresh, I realized there was a lot I didn't remember. And I had never seen King Solomon's Mines, that is. At any rate, I'm basically saying this is the first time I've seen either one because my memory of the first was not very sharp. So those are going to be the two movies we talk about. And in order to do so, I'm going to be back with the basics.
Ruthless invaders on a defenseless planet. And a daring band of space adventurers fighting to save it. Battle Beyond the Stars. A battle that ends in a desperate gamble.
They'll be able to board us.
It won't make any difference.
Richard Thomas, George Peppard, Robert Vaughn, John Saxon. Battle Beyond the Stars. Rated PG. Starts Friday.
Okay, I'm back and it's time for some basics for today's films, starting with 1980's Battle Beyond the Stars. Now, I don't always mention producers in this segment, but I have to here because it is none other than the king of exploitation cinema, Roger Corman, legendary B-movie maker known for making lots and lots and lots of B-movies. But he's also known for mentoring many other filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola, Ron Howard, Martin Scorsese, James Cameron, and many others through the course of his career. Corman doesn't direct here, as he often does. Instead, we have Jimmy T. Murakami. Much like Corman, he made a career as an everything man, sometimes writing, sometimes producing, sometimes directing, sometimes working in art departments. As a director, his most significant works are this film, as well as Humanoids from the Deep and a segment of the Heavy Metal movie. All right, writing, we have another Corman protege, John Sayles. Yet another guy who had a Corman-esque approach to working in film. He did writing, he did directing, producing, and even acting in a lot of smaller films. The music here is handled by James Horner, who we've mentioned on the show before. He's also known for Aliens, Field of Dreams, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and many others. All right, so we'll talk about casting. The cast is an interesting one. Leading the way as farmer and would-be leader of an uprising Shad is Richard Thomas, best known, of course, as John Boy from the Waltons. Good night, John Boy. Next is Robert Vaughn as Gelt, the assassin and hired gun. Vaughn had a long career appearing in dozens of movies across a wide range of genres, like Bullet, The Towering Inferno, Hangar 18, Superman 3, and things like Chud 2 and Basketball even, among others. John Saxon plays evil leader Sador. Saxon is another actor with dozens and dozens of credits, but he's best known as Roper in Enter the Dragon and for parts in several Nightmare on Elm Street movies, among a huge multitude of roles, including a lot in the exploitation genre. George Peppard plays Shad's ally Cowboy, an earthly fighter pilot. Peppard also had a long, successful career, but of course he's best known for appearing in Breakfast at Tiffany's and for playing, of course, Hannibal in the A-Team. All right, continuing on, B-movie legend Sybil Danning plays Saint X-Men, a warrior looking to prove herself in battle. Sam Jaffe plays Dr. Hephaestus. Jaffe is a Hollywood old-timer, having first been in movies as early as 1916, and is known for The Day the Earth Stood Still, Ben-Hur, and obviously a lot of others. Darlene Flugel plays Nanelia, Shad's love interest and daughter of Dr. Hephaestus. Jeff Corey plays legendary old Corsair Zed. Morgan Woodward plays the vengeful Cayman in a lot of special effects, makeup, and prosthetics. And Marta Kristen plays Cowboy's love interest Lux. Alright, so this film was made because Roger Corman wanted to make a space epic in the vein of Star Wars, obviously. It was his biggest budget up to this point, actually. It still wasn't a lot, as you'll see when Claude discusses the financials, and most of it went to paying Peppard and Vaughn, but they still get a lot out of what they had. The plot is very much based on Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. It was actually legendary director James Cameron's major break into film. He was responsible for a wide variety of production design, art direction, special effects, and again, what he pulled off on the budget they had is pretty respectable. We'll talk about that later. Also, actor Bill Paxton worked as a carpenter on the set. He would, of course, develop a friendship with Cameron and would go on to appear in many of his films. All right. Pop culture footprint for this film. This movie did okay at the time. It was a minor financial success, as you'll see, but it didn't spawn any merchandise or toys or adaptations to speak of. Its pop culture footprint isn't huge now either. There's of course a small cult following, as there often is, and they managed to crowdfund a couple of toys, and in 2010 there was a comic prequel miniseries from Blue Water Productions. There don't seem to be any projects in the works to continue the franchise at this time though. Okay. Next up is 1985's King Solomon's Mines. Directing here is John Lee Thompson. Thompson started making movies in the 30s and is known for award winners like Ice Cold Alex and The Guns of Navarone. Later on, he would do a lot of cult movies like this and Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. Writing credit here goes to Gene Quintano and James Silke, based on the novel by H. Rider Haggard. Quintano is known for several Police Academy sequels and sequels to this movie as well, among many others. Silk is best known for cult movies like this one, The Barbarians, and Ninja 3, The Domination. Alright, the cast. First up, as public domain adventurer Alan Quartermain, is Richard Chamberlain. Chamberlain had an extensive acting career, but he's best known for a lot of TV miniseries, including Shogun and The Thornbirds. Playing the woman who hires Quartermain, Jessie Houston, is Sharon Stone in one of her earliest roles. Stone needs no introduction, of course, but she's best known for things like Basic Instinct, Casino, The Specialist, and many others. Playing the villainous German Colonel Bachner is Herbert Lom. He's known for roles in the Pink Panther film franchise. Playing the other main villain, Dogati, is none other than John Rhys Davies, who is also in a very similar and more successful Indiana Jones, of course. The main cast is finished off by Ken Gampu as Quartermain ally and tribal leader Umbopo, and there's an uncredited Bernard Archard as Professor Houston. This movie was obviously an attempt by the producing Cannon Group to take advantage of the success of the Indiana Jones franchise, even though Indiana Jones is very much inspired by the character Alan Quartermain that had also appeared in previous films. A decent cast and some overspending by Cannon on the marketing led to this being a moderate financial success, especially since this film and the sequel, Alan Quartermain and the Lost City of Gold, were shot simultaneously. But that moderate success may also have been a contributor to Cannon's eventual downfall, as that habit of overspending wouldn't always be the best approach to filmmaking. Alright, pop culture footprint, not much. It made a moderate profit, but there wasn't a lot of associated merchandise with this film either. The sequel tanked horribly, and the intended trilogy never happened due to Cannon Group's financial struggles. There's no real footprint now either, besides a 1997 re-release. There's never been much of a cult following or fandom. There's no projects intended to continue this particular franchise, although the character has popped up in other places due to it being public domain. So if you want to, you can pretend Quartermain's story is caught up on later in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, I guess. All right, I guess that's it for the basics. I'm once again going to give up my spot to Claude for the tale of the tape.
For one man to beat an entire army to a priceless fortune takes more than courage, more than cunning, more than the unexpected.
Great reflexes.
It takes a plan.
You take the 1,000 on the right, I'll take the 1,000 on the left.
Richard Chamberlain is Alan Quartermain in King Solomon's Mines.
Starts Friday, November 22nd. Consult your local listings.
Greetings, fight fans and movie buffs. I'm your friend Claude, here with the tale of the tape for our main event of the evening. Now let's see how our contenders match up, and start as we always do with the distributing studio. For Battle Beyond the Stars, we have a returning company that is a specializer, if you will, in movies of this type and less quality. We saw them before on our Hell Comes to Frogtown episode. It is New World Pictures. And over for King Solomon's Mines, it is the infamous Cannon Group. Lots can be said, but instead, I will tell you what these movies are rated. PG for Battle Beyond the Stars. And this is yet another one of those old-fashioned PG movies. You get some good old language that you can't say in today's PG movies, and kind of some serious moments. And PG-13 for King Solomon's Mines. And let's just say this is also an old-fashioned PG-13. And you will have to watch it to find out why. Running times, they are fairly evenly matched. 100 minutes for Battle Beyond the Stars, and 105 minutes for King Solomon's Mines. Both of them, however, feel much longer. These are the kind of movies we talk about frequently on this show, where some extra editing and would have helped. And when you watch them, certain scenes just feel like you're watching a 3+ hour movie. No way around it. As for release dates, a little bit different. July 25th, 1980 for Battle Beyond the Stars, and November 22nd, 1985 for King Solomon's Mines, the 100-year anniversary of the novel King Solomon's Mines. Down in the budget department, Battle Beyond the Stars was made for a trim $2 million. And I have to say that it does show in some parts, but boy, I was impressed by how they made use of it overall. King Solomon's Mines was a bit more of an expensive affair at, in true canon fashion, either $11 million or $12.6 million. The world may never know, because those folks over at Canon were cooking the book something fierce. As for how much they made, comparable. However, Battle Beyond the Stars is a bit more impressive because on a $2 million budget, it brought in $11 million. And, again, this is 1980, 40 plus years ago. A decent profit for a movie that didn't have any continuation to the story. Over in King Solomon's Mines, though, it brought in $15 million on an $11 or $12.5 million budget. So, essentially breaking even with a little bit more. However, since both King Solomon's Mines and its sequel were being shot at the same time, you're essentially making $15 million on a roughly $5 million budget, $5.5. So, not a bad return on investment overall. So as you can see, this is how the numbers shake out between our two combatants. Now let's open the doors and settle some scores.
All right, we're back, and it's time to talk about some scoring. So I will go first, and we'll start with Battle Beyond the Stars. First up for visuals, I'm going 7.5. There are some weaknesses to the visuals, but there's a couple of things to think about. First of all, the very limited budget here. Again, we mentioned it was a $2 million budget, and a lot of that money went to paying George Peppard and Robert Vaughn, according to the rumors about the production. And even besides that, I don't even think you have to grade on a curve too much here because of the low budget, because this movie It comes up short of Star Wars, which is the whole point of this episode, the things that these movies are trying to emulate.
How could it not?
Star Wars was obviously a pioneering breakthrough in special effects and visuals and all that, so it's hard to fault it for that too much. But other than Star Wars, this movie basically lives up to almost any movie of this genre and vintage visually.
Agreed.
And largely thanks to James Cameron, as I mentioned before, he did a lot of this work. There are rumors about him using like the takeout containers from McDonald's and spray painting them and gluing them to the walls to create like the interior, nonsense on this, science fiction interior settings. The model work is great. A lot of the camera motion around the ships is great. There are repeated shots, that pads it out a little bit.
Right.
But for the most part, pretty much all of this stuff works. I don't have a lot of problems with the things you could pick at. Like you can tell that they're in a studio when they're supposed to be outside. You can tell when they just have like sort of a still model and they're running special effects behind it.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they rely on some innovation here. Mm-hmm. There are some good shots of spaceships. I mentioned while we were watching it, sometimes you can tell on a science fiction spaceship, especially, I happen to notice it the most in these kind of things. They will bank, they will move off from camera. And sometimes the geometry doesn't look right. Like it'll bank this way, but it won't go that way perfectly. It'll drift.
Yeah.
This movie, when those kind of shots occur, I feel like the geometry looks right. The ships look like they have speed and weight. So all of that stuff works. The costuming, I think, is really good and different. Yep. There's one shortcoming, Saint X-Men.
Yeah.
She's one of the Valkyrie, or if you pronounce it slightly different, Valkyrie. And she very much looks like it. Her initial costume is this big winged helmet and everything. That could be cool, but it's so chunky and it looks like something that you'd see on stage at a Gwar show. And then later on she changes into more of this Barbarella, skin-tight, black latex type of thing. So I think her costuming is a little bit of a shortcoming.
Yeah.
Everything else I think looks pretty good. There's even a pretty good like full prosthesis, special effects makeup / mask that's pretty good. It doesn't move quite as much as you'd like to see, but I think, again, given what they were working with, it's pretty well pulled off. There's one set of allies to the heroes, and they have this third eye.
Yes.
The third eyes on all these characters almost always look pretty good. They're doing a thing where they're self-lit or they're being reflected from an on-screen light. They're inside of some sort of appliance. But there's one scene where it looks like one is simply just painted on. And it happens to be the scene where you have close-ups of this character. It's the first time you see this species.
Right.
So that's another bit of a downgrade for that. But otherwise, other than those two kind of flaws, they look great other than that. And I think most of the special effects shots and the production design and everything looks pretty great. So in other words, I'm going with 7.5. I should get around to the score, 7.5. Performances, I'm going with 6. Everyone's pretty much just shooting straight here. Nothing stands out to me too much. John Saxon is doing exactly what John Saxon always does. And that's true of pretty much everybody. I mean, George Peppard is pretty charming in his character. Robert Vaughn is doing something that's maybe slightly against the usual type for Robert Vaughn. Everything else is pretty standard, again, for a movie of this type and this vintage. So no big problems, no big complaints. But nothing stands out as a tour de force. So I'm going with 6 for performances. Writing, we're going down the scale a little bit. We're dropping under the line, and we're going to 5.5. Mainly, the criticisms for this movie is very ambitious conceptually. So I give it credit for the ambition, but in terms of the how they pull it off, the plot gets a little bit muddy. I'm giving it a 5.5 because the big red flag is that the movie started to feel long, despite only being about 100 minutes.
Yeah.
The final sequence goes on too long, and I think that's at the detriment of, one, the overall runtime, but also, you don't tend to build a lot of emotional connection to a lot of these characters over time, so their deaths don't necessarily feel very important.
No.
And I think some of that time could maybe have been better spent earlier in the film, developing those relationships as each new character is introduced.
Right.
So I think that there was a little bit of an imbalance there, so that kind of brings the score down, pushes us down a little bit below the line that we usually refer to as good, which is 6. So in this case, I'm doing 5.5. All right, 4th category, new category, audio. I got the same score, 5.5. Again, there's some pluses and minuses here. In terms of sound effects, this movie does a little bit, does two things. It does some original sound effects. There are some creative laser bolt things happening. The dialogue is clear. All of those things are pretty good. On the downside, it does also draw from old sound effect archives. Mm-hmm. So they have original laser sounds, and then they have laser sounds we've heard in everything going back to the 1950s. Yep. So they are drawing a lot from that. There are sound effects that are pulled directly from things like Star Wars. We were hearing Darth Vader's breath sound effect when doors were opening on one of the ships. Right. And those doors those doors open quite a few times over the course of 10 or 15 minutes, and every time you hear Darth Vader's and then music, again, the music is a downgrade because it's almost completely unmemorable. I could not, we just watched the movie a couple hours ago, I could not hum the tune to the main theme. There was a moment where I recognized something that was very similar to the Imperial March. And that's about all that sticks out to me. Otherwise, I don't have much memory of the music. That's not to say that it doesn't stand out as bad, but it's not a high point. It's completely forgettable, and it borrows at least that little bit from the Imperial March, as I said. So there's my sets of scores for Battle Beyond the Stars: 7.5, 6, 5.5, and 5.5. Claude, take it away.
Well, this is one of those times when, in one way or another, I kind of agree with virtually every point. So I will start with the visuals. Just slightly below where you rated them at a 7. And most of that comes from the models, the quality of the models, the detail that was put into the models, the confidence that comes across that they have in the models, because a lot of the shots of these things are very close up.
Yep. They are well lit.
Yeah, they are not afraid to get in there and show you what they're doing.
We've talked about past low budget movies where they're hiding a lot of their set design and things like that. This movie does not hide anything.
You would expect that from a movie at a $2 million level, but they get right in there and not even almost immediately, from opening, they're going, "Hey, this is what we've got," and it's impressive. Especially on that scale, and especially from the perspective of a movie that is not ripping off, but directly competing with something like Star Wars. And this comes out at the time when, Empire Strikes Back is already a thing. So Star Wars has a solid cultural impact already. And so the measuring stick is pretty high. And to come up to a 7 in the visual department in the face of that on a $2 million budget is impressive to me. If you watch our episode on Hell Comes to Frogtown, it's a similar breakdown of the visuals that apply to this movie as it did in that one, where it's clear that they had to pick and choose what they emphasized, what they spent the most time and care on. But when they are able to do that, it shines. So 7 on visuals. Performances, I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I give it the same score, 6. At the time, some of these names were bigger names, relatively speaking, than obviously we think of today. But I feel like everybody is on even footing. And actually, I found myself somewhat impressed with Richard Thomas. Not necessarily in his character being special or memorable or any of the direct interactions, but I felt like he was able to convey a lot of the in-ship reactions really well. I found myself buying into it often, and I was surprised by that. Because I expected to, this is the guy from the Waltons, and now it's John Boy in space, and, here comes the ship explosion, whatever.
Oh, I want to see that movie. Waltons in space.
The thrilling adventure we never knew we needed. But he, for whatever reason, I related and kind of bought into what he was doing in those moments. And he probably has the most emotional weight to carry throughout the course of the movie. And again, he's not winning any awards for it, but he handles it, I guess, better than the guy from the Waltons. That sure. You would expect a guy from the Waltons to do that. I always love George Peppard. He is more talented and more charismatic than I think his legacy creates the perception of. And even though his character in this movie is a Han Solo, a caracature perhaps, but I mean, if there's one guy who can pull it off, it's him, and I think he does so very well. And I'll just give credit for the Sybil Danning performance of making the best of those outfits.
That's true.
For writing, I'm going to have to go even a little bit lower than you did, and just a straight 5. I'm a big dialogue person. That's kind of the first thing I think of when I think of writing. The other thing I think of is how well you're able to follow the story and the plot. We mentioned a few times that the movie feels long, and the writing could have been a lot tighter. And not just tighter, but more focused, more clear. The plot points, the beats of the story get to be a little hard to follow. Some of it is due to being repetitive. Some of it is due to things like not refining the concept as much as I kind of wanted them to. A lot of the character names are odd and obscure and hard to hear and hard to say.
Yeah.
We sort of mentioned how Star Wars has this legacy of merchandise and toy sales, and there's some good character designs in this movie, but nobody's gonna look for an action figure of a character that they can't even remember the name of. And we thought that Star Wars kind of struck that balance of like odd names, but they're still pronounceable and memorable. And this kind of doesn't. So even though the writing kind of gets convoluted and there isn't a lot of great dialogue, there are still some memorable quotes that you can come away with. And the first one that jumped right out at me that I couldn't stop repeating in my brain and even out loud was, I eat serpents 7 times a week. So, even though the writing is a little subpar and a little meandering, there's still some jewels in there. As far as the audio goes, I have to repeat your score, 5.5 for me as well. Again, the $2 million budget kind of, you assume going into that because of that you're going to get a lot of these, like, as you said, these stock sound effects and just like paint by numbers music, and that this is an area they're going to cut corners on. And for the most part, they don't. And there are, as you said, a certain handful of times where they do use sound effects that are clearly from other things. The Darth Vader breathing. Also, there's the engine powering up sound on the main ship is right out of Star Trek.
That's right.
Music, even though it is by seasoned professional composer James Horner, who we've talked about in the show before for Willow and other things, it's just kind of there.
Yeah.
And maybe this is early in his career. I'm not entirely sure. Obviously, it's earlier. And you said you heard a little bit of the Imperial March in one scene. In the very beginning of the first act, I heard a little bit of the Superman theme. So, obviously, somebody making a space movie in the late 70s, early 80s is going to John Williams' bank.
That's right.
To see what they can rummage through. And that's apparent here. And that's why I give the audio a 5.5. So, just to recap my scores for Battle Beyond the Stars, 7, 6, 5, 5.5.
All right, well, that's one set of scores. In just a minute, we'll be back with another. All right, we're back. Time for another set of scores. This time it'll be King Solomon's Mines, and this time Claude will go first.
Okay, starting off with the visuals for King Solomon's Mines. I am going to go with the same score that I gave Battle Beyond the Stars, a 7. So in the case of King Solomon's Mines, I would say that visually the strong points for me are the costuming. I remarked when we were watching it that they use a lot of extras.
Yeah.
And every single one of them is in full, authentic as possible costumes for each of the location settings that they use. And maybe it's a trick of the numbers, but it creates a really dense visual of fairly detailed costumes. So that comes across as pretty impressive. Some of the effects are kind of on par for the time, which is surprising for a Canon production. Some of them are very corner cutting. As we said while we're watching the movie, some of the green screen, blue screen, matte lines around the actors in certain scenes jump out at you as, in the 80s, every movie had that noticeable.
Yeah.
But this is maybe even a step more than that.
Yeah.
As you will see if you follow the lineage of Canon films. But yeah, overall, a lot of the props, a lot of the costumes, they really impressed me visually. So, as far as performances go, I'm actually going to go fairly high at 7.5 because it contrasts for me with Battle Beyond the Stars, whereas the performances in that movie were mostly similar and mostly fairly sedate, with a few exceptions. The performances in this movie are energetic, are dialed up, are exaggerated, very high energy, very over the top, and not necessarily in a bad way, in a surprisingly consistent way. Sometimes the movie tonally is a little bit unbalanced, but throughout that it maintains a very animated energy from the cast members. Everybody from Richard Chamberlain, who is the cartoon version of Indiana Jones, almost.
Right, yeah.
Sharon Stone is every damsel in distress, but as if she just had 6 cups of coffee before she got into trouble. And the list goes on and on. The henchmen, the villains. There's several villains. There's several minor characters. There's small parts, and even all the teeming masses of extras are all they're all either singing in unison or dancing in unison or running around at the same time. They went for it. Everybody in this movie went for energy. It's a well-known behind-the-scenes story in the Richard Donner Superman that the word he kind of carried throughout production was verisimilitude, just to remind everybody this has to be believable. And it seems like the word that the director told everybody every day, every scene, is energy. So I think that comes across, and the performances, because of that, they get fairly high marks for me. Obviously, Indiana Jones is the template, and they are doing the best possible impression of that template and those characters, but then even making it their own a little bit. So overall, I was fairly impressed with the performances for a movie that is kind of dismissible on the surface. Cannot say the same, however, for the writing. I have to give that a 5, as I did for Battle Beyond the Stars, because again, these movies are matched but mismatched in a certain way. However, the writing in this it's a bit convoluted. It's a bit overly detailed in some aspects, and it's a bit unclear in others. There's one scene involving Sharon Stone's character's father, who...
Dr. Houston.
There we go.
Professor Houston.
Professor Houston, who kind of appears abruptly, doesn't really get established and introduced to you in a way that you know who it is when he shows up on screen, and his exit is similarly ambiguous. We found ourselves having to go back and rewatch the scene to make sure we understood what happened to that guy. So it's moments like that sort of kind of hamper the overall writing. And being a dialogue-focused guy, I am, however, rewarded a little bit in this movie. And one of the things that sticks with me the most was the German villain. Later in the movie, he's forced to swallow diamonds. And he says, Don't worry, Germans make the best laxatives. I'll think of you when I sit down to count my blessings. Now, I mean, again, this is... The Academy Award does not go to. However, the award in my heart for this evening's movie viewing certainly goes to a line like that. As far as audio, 6.5. Good, plus a little bit extra. We have another recognizable composer for the music, Jerry Goldsmith, who I came to know through the Rambo movies. And there's even a part in this movie where Alan Quartermain is like looking up through the floorboards with a gun, and it's very reminiscent of the Rambo score. But overall, he avoids kind of recycling motifs, and yet it remains pretty identifiably Jerry Goldsmith music. And overall, I feel like the music was not dominant, but more of a presence in this movie than it was in Battle Beyond the Stars. I can't hum it, but I feel more impacted by it. I feel like it came in to underscore the drama a little bit more and a little bit better. And overall, I felt like it was just more of a consistent presence in this movie. So, my scores, once again, for King Solomon's Mines, 7, 7.5, 5, and 6.5.
My scores for King Solomon's Mines, we'll start with visuals, as we always do. Anyway, 6.5. It's a downgrade from Battle Beyond the Stars for me because, to me, the visuals here are more standard for this type of fare. For a swashbuckling adventure, the visuals I find then to be exactly what you'd expect. You're right about a lot of what you said in terms of costume design. You have a lot of people on screen and they all look appropriate. It all looks very cohesive. There are a lot of set pieces that are kind of impressive. There's a big cauldron scene. And you mentioned in the other movie where you could tell sometimes where a lot of the budget goes. Yeah. And this is a scene where you could tell a lot of the budget was going to this, they're going to get cooked in a giant cauldron it's right out of a Bugs Bunny cartoon. There's vegetables floating in water in a giant pot. And they start to rocket to escape. So you had, this thing that they must have built on a gimbal with water that was splashing. It was burning from below. So it was very big. You had a very multi-ton piece of machinery that had to be built in order to create this effect. Later, they're in a cave with a collapsing ceiling, reminiscent of Temple of Doom. So there was interesting set pieces, and it all looks fun and adventure-y, and it's all very competent, and 6.5 is good, plus a little bit, as you said earlier from one of your scores. But I just find them to be sort of standard. That's why I give it a 6.5, because they're competent, a little bit extra, standard for the genre. You're right that a lot of the matte effects were a little bit... they leave something to be desired. Yeah. And I think it's not just the outline, because you see that a lot in those kind of effects of this era, which is part of the charm in a lot of ways. I think where this movie falls a little bit flat is, again, to compare it to the other movie, I talked about Battle Beyond the Stars doing a good job of getting the geometry right. Mm-hmm. I was finding that to be a problem in some of these effects with King Solomon's Mines, where the background's not moving in the right direction compared to what they are reacting to. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times the background is very clearly something that was pulled from stock footage, or it's being played at a different speed or a different resolution than what you're seeing in the foreground. And so I think that was a little bit of a downgrade on some of those effects. But otherwise, very competent, just not spectacular in my opinion. So for performances, I'm going a little bit up from Battle of the Stars, not quite as high as you. So this is, I think, where we differ the most by a full point. I give it 6.5. You're right, there's a lot of energy happening. Everybody seems very committed to their role. Richard Chamberlain cuts a good swashbuckling hero, for sure. Sharon Stone is also good as Jessie Houston, because she is a damsel in distress, but she's got a little bit of that Marion Ravenwood from Indiana Jones in her. She's punching dudes in the face, and she's handling her business. She's competent in some ways, in other ways she's not, but the very same could be said for the Quartermain character. He very much bumbles through parts of this movie. And so I have nothing bad to say about the performances. Like I said, 6.5, again, like my other score, that is good plus a little extra. They have a lot of energy, but I think that starts to become a con as it connects to the next category, which is writing. So, like you, I'm giving the writing a 5 here, which is well below that line of good. It's very uneven, and I think that from my point of view, that relates poorly to the performances. I find this movie to take. You said it takes that Indiana Jones formula and kind of turns it up a little bit, but we mentioned I think it was you, and I have to give you credit for this. Said it takes that, but it goes almost into like George of the Jungle humor and comedy here. There are scenes where it's literally like the camera is sped up.
Yeah.
There might as well have been zing and pow and slide whistle sound effects in some of these
Batman
shots.
Type.
Yeah, I mean there might as well have been in some of these issues. So I found it to be a little bit too wide of a gulf between what they were trying to do. So very uneven. Also, like Indiana Jones, this movie is going for an adventure serial, but it pounds you almost too much. Every 5 minutes, they will escape from the cauldron, okay, and immediately there's a lion blocking them from escape. So they don't escape the cauldron, they make the cauldron roll away, roll to the bottom of a hill. Oh, it's time to go. Now there's a lion in front of them. I mean, it goes right from one to the other. A little bit too goofy, in my opinion.
It is an obstacle course.
Very uneven. And there's so much of that, too, that it stays very busy. But again, I find myself thinking, as I'm watching, this movie's getting a little long in the tooth. A little bit, not long in the tooth, but just a little bit long in general. Mm-hmm. And so again, I think this movie could have benefited, like Battle Beyond the Stars, to some shaving off, some tightening up. This movie is 105 minutes, I think.
Yep.
And I think there's a pretty good, entertaining 80-minute movie here. But it's just stretched a little too thin. And then the other thing that kind of brings it down, this is tough. I don't want to get too much into this sort of thing, but there are some super distasteful things happening in this movie with our hero kind of flippantly disregards like the race trade that's happening. There's literally a slave trade. And he's like, oh, looks like a good deal. He does free those slaves later, but there's a couple moments where it's like, I don't know about that. But I don't like to give it too much of a downgrade for that stuff because the movie was made in 85.
Product of its time.
I'm not going to try to apply too much of like today's social standards to something that was made almost 40 years ago. So basically, so a lot of my criticisms come to the unevenness of the tone, and it's always a red flag when a movie is this busy and still seems long. So there are things that could have been cut away for sure. Audio, again, I'm kind of following your lead here, and I'm going 6.5 as you did. The standard audio, the sound editing, the sound effects, all very good, all very competent. There was one scene where the dialogue got a little muddled, but I think that might have been a problem with the version of the film we were watching. I don't think that was. I think that was just like that scene was muddled. It might have been a degradation in the film originally.
Yeah.
Other than that, it was fine. The music is a big upgrade from Battle Beyond the Stars. As you said, it's another good pedigree in terms of the composer.
Right.
And it's a very soaring score that matches this epic adventure that you're seeing. So it's very appropriate. Like you, I don't have it in my head. I cannot hum it right now, but it left a stronger impact on me and a more positive opinion. I wasn't hearing exact derivative bits of other scores sprinkled in.
Right.
In my head, I was hearing Indiana Jones just because I was seeing something that looked like Indiana Jones. But I mean, I think that it was very impressive and very soaring, very competently done, and so I give it a little bit of that extra boost over good to 6.5. No big criticisms, also not super memorable. So those are my scores for King Solomon's Mines, plural. 6.5, 6.5, 5, and 6.5. So that's 2 complete sets of scores. We're going to do some math, and we'll be back with the big board. And we're back with some final scores for Battle Beyond the Stars versus King Solomon's Mines. We have a winner. We have 6.00 for Battle Beyond the Stars, and for King Solomon's Mines, we have 6.32 for the victory today. Any initial thoughts or surprises here?
I almost call that a TKO. That's so kind of near. It's that tiny margin. These movies in general have kind of surprised me. I have to say I enjoyed Battle Beyond the Stars more than I thought I would. I kind of am right at where I expected to be with King Solomon's Mines. A couple surprises. I will say that Battle Beyond the Stars seems like it intrigued me enough to really kind of wonder what it would have been like if it was a full movie level budget and, you know, it took care of some of those shortcomings a little bit. It would have been nice to see.
Yeah, it does so well with what it has. Like, what if it had a little bit more?
If you looked at this through the lens of straight parody, would it be a little more enjoyable, or would that help your experience? And we spoke off camera while we were watching it about this is the middle tier in a stepladder of Indiana Jones related content, where Raiders is at the bottom for the foundation, the seriousness. This one is level 2, where it kind of vacillates between wild comedy and seriousness. And I mentioned that there's a Magnum PI episode where they do a Raiders of the Lost Ark homage / parody, which raises the comedy even higher. It's called Legend of the Lost Art. And exactly. Right from the title, it's a play on words, and it just does not let up. So, I mean, seek that out if you want to experience every tier. But coming at this movie, I think if you temper some of your expectations, this is very enjoyable.
Yeah, the movie does. It's pretty wild with its tone, as I mentioned earlier. You know, you look at it as parody, maybe you can sort of appreciate that tone more. But I think, you know, this movie actually reminds me of a lot of the recent Marvel fare.
Yeah.
Where you have, the movie makers are trying to have both things. They're trying to have real pathos and danger.
Yep.
And they're trying to have really goofy comedy. Mm-hmm. And it can sometimes be hard to pull off. I have to mention a couple things I didn't mention during the scoring session that I think are just interesting and fun. There is a scene, it just illustrates the tone, the inconsistent tone of King Solomon's Mines. One is a scene where they are rescued by a tribe of indigenous African people who hang upside down by one leg, and Sharon Stone's character is shown veiled in light through a soft lens. She looks like Galadriel from The Lord of the Rings. It looks like they're in upside down Rivendell all of a sudden. It's so out of nowhere. And then the other thing that's super ridiculous, but I found to be really fun, was John Rhys Davies' character's complete indestructibility. This man is the Rasputin of Turkey. He is shot and thought to die and comes back. Then he's buried alive under tons of collapsing mountain and thought to die.
We watch boulders crush him.
Then he shows up again and gets in a fist fight while on fire. And finally, we think he dies when he is thrown into a pit of lava. But, you know what? I wouldn't be surprised if he comes back again. So watch out for John Rhys Davies. He's indestructible. But nevertheless, despite all those things, I mean, so uneven tone. Today, King Solomon's Mines comes away with the win at 6.32. Two fun watches. From my personal perspective, I'm more likely to go back to Battle Beyond the Stars, but as always, we respect the scoring here.
Right. And I personally would like to leave you with one last quote from each movie. From King Solomon's Mines, I don't believe in the mines, but I'm starting to believe in you. And from Battle Beyond the Stars, live fast, fight well, and have a beautiful ending.
Well, I guess on that, we will end this episode. The premiere episode of Season 2 of Nerd Bomber vs. Movies. As always, you can find us here on YouTube. You must have already. We also have a podcast. We have an Instagram page called the Nerd Bomber Podcast, and there you can find links to everything we do. It's the best place to go. For your friend Claude, I've been Just Jamie. And until the next battle,
aloha.
Please deposit litter in trash receptacles as you exit the auditorium. Thanks for visiting with us. Buckle up and drive safely. See you next week.